since when do otters like mud? For most of my life, when I think about otters, I think about this open, rocky coast area. And I think about otters all curled, floating around and all curled up in the kelp. I don't think about them in an environment like this, in the meandering channels of a slough, like Elkhorn Slough. Here they are, hauled out on the pickleweed, wandering around having a good time. Why are they here? Very good question. They're really just doing what they've always done. So otters used to live up and down the entire coast. And this is especially the southern sea otter. It's a special subspecies, and it used to be just dotting the coast all up and down. And it was almost decimated in the late 1800s during the fur trade. They were hunted down, and by the 1930s, they thought they were completely extinct. Turns out there were only a handful of otters that were living on the coast in this area of Bixby Creek, and hiding in the kelp. Since then, they've been expanding back out into their range, and within the last 15 years or so, they've expanded back into Elkhorn Slough, and they're living there and thriving there. And what I'm going to talk about today is not my work, it's work of my colleagues, and it's about what they're doing now that they've come back into the slough, because they were gone for about 100 years. And so the slough has changed because they haven't been there. And before I get into that, I'm going to talk about what they're doing, what they've done, and what the classic model is for what's happening on the open coast. So how many of you have heard of a keystone species? Keystone species, is anybody? Okay, so otters serve as a keystone species. And what that means, this is an arch. It's a classic keystone. That piece of brick is the thing that holds the whole arch up and keeps it all together. And when you take this concept and you apply it to what's happening out in the environment, the ecosystems are the same way. They're being held together by the relationship of the different species that are there. And in the case of otters in the kelp forest, so here's the definition of it. So their presence affects the ecosystem more profoundly than their size and numbers would suggest. And what that means is one species can control what an ecosystem looks like. Normally it's because of what they eat. They eat a lot of something that has an impact on something else and something else. So we'll go through what that is. So let's look at otters in a kelp forest. If you have sea otters in your kelp forest out on the open coast, this is what your kelp forest looks like. If you don't, this is what your kelp forest looks like. Why is this? Because sea otters really like sea urchins, and they eat a lot of them. So when they're eating a lot of sea urchins, there aren't that many, and they're not doing what they like to do. What do sea otters like to do? They like to eat kelp. So when you have sea otters, they're eating the sea urchins, and you have a thriving kelp bed. And that thriving kelp bed provides habitat for young fish and for all sorts of things. It provides that habitat structure that allows a whole environment to live. And without the sea otters, you don't have that anymore. The sea otters are eating away that habitat, and animals can't live there. So you have a profoundly different ecosystem occurring there. And so looking at Elkhorn Slough and what the otters are doing there, so that my colleagues were like, okay, we have about 200 otters that have moved back into the slough. They haul out on the pickleweed, they run around, they're having a great time. It's the highest concentration of mothers and pups in the entire range of the species. So what's happening? Are they doing something there as profound as what they're doing out on the open coast? So let's look at some of the other habitats. One of the most important habitats in Elkhorn Slough is eelgrass. And aside from providing a really special place for mermaids to live, it also provides a nursery habitat. So a bed of eelgrass in the slough is going to provide a habitat for fish to grow in. Young fish can come in, they can hide in the grass, they can live, they can grow bigger. things can come in and eat them, but they have a hiding place. And so this is one of the most critical habitats in the slough, and we haven't had that much of it. We've had very little, but we've been getting more. We've been getting more and more as time has gone on. So the otters showed up and back up into the slough in around 1985, and their numbers have been slowly increasing. And so has our eelgrass. Our eelgrass has slowly been increasing. So what's happening here? Well, we have something else that sort of is another piece of this puzzle. If you look closely at our eelgrass, there's a diatom film on the top of it. And that diatom film is fed by all the nutrients coming out of the Salinas River. So one of the unique things we have about Elkhorn Slough is that we are connected to the entire Salinas watershed. And all of the ag and all of the nutrients that are going into that come down the Salinas River. And on the incoming tides, a lot of these nutrients get sucked into the slough. That creates a very nutrient-rich area. The diatoms that live on eelgrass they grow really fast and they cover the eelgrass. So what does that do? They don't get sun and they can't grow. So before the otters started moving in, our eelgrass beds were in decline because they were getting too much nutrients, too many diatoms, and starting to die off. Since then, the eelgrass has been expanding. So what's happening? So here we have a typical slough diagram without sea otters here and with sea otters here. So without sea otters, I'm going to introduce you to a couple of different species, and these are they're called different trophic levels. And trophic levels are when a species will eat another species. So you have, for example, cows that eat grass. So you have grass, and then you have cows, and then you have us. And that's that's three different trophic levels. So in the slough, there's a little nudibranch that eats the diatoms, and the crabs eat the nudibranchs. So the crabs love that nudibranch, and they will completely eat them. So when you have a lot of crabs, you have very few nudibranchs, and the nudibranchs are eating the diatoms. So very few crabs, lots of crabs, very few nudibranchs, lots of diatoms, very little eelgrass. But when you have otters, otters love crabs. So otters are eating they're not eating all the crabs, but they're eating a lot of the crabs. And they're keeping the crab population down. So what does that mean? That means that the little nudibranchs are now all over the place. There's tons of nudibranchs. And they're cleaning off the blades of eelgrass. So the eelgrass is now thriving and growing a lot more. So it's good to have eelgrass. So this is the paper that I was just presenting you, the concepts behind it. This was presented in PNAS. It's the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. It was published a couple of years ago by my colleagues. And it looked at, so this one, I'll go through this title a little bit, Recovery of a Top Predator Mediates Negative Eutrophic Effects on Seagrass. And what that means is that the otter is controlling this ecosystem and changing it so the nutrients that have been impacting this particular species of eelgrass is being mitigated or changed because of that, and because of their presence there and how they increase. Does anybody have any questions on this? Because this is a little bit of a difficult concept, and I just want to make sure that you have, if any questions.
It's a jungle out there.
It's a jungle. Yes. Yes.
Why is having more eelgrass a good thing?
It's a special habitat, so it's a nursery habitat, and the Elkhorn Slough serves as one of the biggest nursery habitats in this area. For example, flatfish. There's flatfish fishery that's out in the bay. 60% of the fish that are found in the bay, in this flatfish species, have spent some period of their time in Elkhorn Slough, and a lot of that has been in the eelgrass beds. So not very much eelgrass. If we reduce our amount of eelgrass, then we end up reducing the number of flatfish, the species of flatfish, or the number that we can catch. And that's tied to a number of different species. That's why it's such a protected area, because there's so many different species in it. Yeah?
Are otters on the endangered species list?
They are. They're definitely on the endangered species list, and it will take them a very long time to actually come off of that because they've been growing in numbers, but because there were so few of them, they're not as robust genetically, and so they're susceptible to a lot of different diseases and things. Kyle.
The nudibranch. Now,
Yes.
I have seen them ocean, saltwater, very colorful. What are they about here?
It's the same kind of thing. They're colorful in the ocean because they don't want to be eaten, so
Are
they're
they
colorful.
worms?
They're not worms, they're related to snails. Yeah, so they do the same kind of thing. They have a tongue like a file and they scrape little diatoms off here they scrape diatoms off the eelgrass, and out in the bay they scrape algae off of rocks and things. All right, well, Annette, one more since I still have a green light.
Okay, so you're saying nutrients from the Salinas River, but
Yes.
I do know that there are other agents that probably aren't as nutritious for the environment.
It's true.
How are they affecting the slough?
Well, that's a bigger question, I think, than what I can address today, but one of the things that eelgrass beds do is they help to filter out those pesticides and things that aren't good. So in terms of what eelgrass beds are doing, they're helping that. So the more eelgrass and the more marsh we have, the more filtration and cleaner water we'll have. So, can I take one more on an orange light? All right, orange light, quickly.
Other than humans, what is the greatest predator for the otters? Who controls the otters if they need to control them?
Sharks.
Sharks.
Yeah, so in our area, it's white sharks. Yeah, all right, well, great, thank you very much.
Fellow Toastmasters, honored guest, especially Monique. Monique came before us today to give the fourth project in the Advanced Communication Manual for Technically Speaking. And that project has 3 objectives. She's supposed to present the technical paper in a way that's interesting. She's supposed to effectively use her presentation slides. And she's supposed to enhance her talk by doing something like answering questions effectively. I'm sure we all agree on all 3 of those points. Monique did a magnificent job. I really liked several aspects of her speech, starting with her opening. She used her title, which asked a question. Most of us don't associate otters, and particularly sea otters, with mud. But she also had 2 pictures that illustrated the different environments. And that led into, quite naturally, a discussion of how otters have returned to the slough. And into what was really the most important part of her presentation, and that was to illustrate the concept of a keystone species and to show how this particular keystone species is affecting life in the slough. And she did that with several illustrations and with beautiful pictures and well-crafted and well-chosen words that really brought the concept home. And of course, she was then very authoritative and very prompt in answering questions, and she took more and more questions because her talk was just that interesting. And all of those things made this a very powerful speech. There's only a few ways that I think she could improve this speech. I would recommend that she introduce the paper a little sooner to us. That made her organization a bit disjointed. And that somewhere she summarized that main point about the keystone species for us. And that would lead into a stronger conclusion where she could bring back that summary of what the keystone species means to the slough. But overall, her enthusiasm for the topic, her manner, her voice, her gestures, everything just had me enwrapped. She's an inveterate storyteller, and she used her storytelling skills to tell us a story in a way that brought a technical paper to the entire audience. And that was what made this speech so magnificent. Thank you.